A friend of mine suggested a silent retreat in the Himalayas, which was a Buddhist temple on top of a mountain. I initially laughed this off. I think I had a lot of insecurity at that time and just really wasn't sure of myself. And so I was completely put off by what the people in my life would think of me going and doing this. It wasn't like, will I actually enjoy it? It was like, what would the guys at work think if I went and did a Buddhist retreat?
Welcome to The Slowdown, your time to define success and growth for yourself with a little inspiration from others. I could not wait for this conversation with Hector Hughes. After a silent retreat in the Himalayas, Hector quit his tech job and co-founded Unplugged, a company offering off-grid cabin retreats designed to help people escape their screens and reclaim presence. I was fascinated by the idea of creating a business in our hyper-capitalist and materialist world that actually invites you to slow down. Since launching in 2020, Unplugged has grown rapidly and ignited a movement towards intentional rest. Hector's story in this episode is a reminder that sometimes the best way forward is to step back. Can't wait for you to dive in. Thank you so much for being here, Hector.
Oh, I mean, such a pleasure. Huge fan of the podcast, so excited.
You're actually a rare guest in the sense that we've never met before, so I don't already know your backstory. A lot of my previous guests have been close friends, people that I've been watching in the industry for a long time. So I'm actually just a fan of what you've built and reached out to you. So I'm very excited to actually hear your story firsthand in real time. As a top line, you're the co-founder of Unplugged, a company offering off-grid cabin retreats designed to help people disconnect from digital life and reconnect to nature. It's a digital detox solution. Since its inception in 2020, Unplugged has grown rapidly, attracting a substantial following and promoting intentional rest in a hyper-connected world. Can you first provide me with some context? Because I'm super interested about the actual journey that people's lives take. Where were you raised, by whom, and what were your earliest significant memories?
So I was raised in the Cotswolds, little village in the Cotswolds. It's now very bougie, but it wasn't so bougie back then.
Right, the pre-Soho House.
Yeah, it was just around the corner from there, like Dalesford, just down the road from Dalesford Organics. But yeah, back then it wasn't like that. And my parents are both lawyers. They're very affable, perhaps a little on the reserve side, as with lots of English families, which I think is a trait that I definitely took on in my early life. And I have a twin sister and a younger sister. So yeah, it was a very quiet existence in this little village. And then went off to school. And I think my earliest kind of defining memories, a lot around school, I think one of the big things was I am dyslexic. And I remember that being very front of mind early on, just because obviously in the school system, when your brain works a little differently, then it's not such a good fit. And so I remember really struggling at reading and writing and that just being a very kind of defining part of my childhood. Always found maths very easy. And anything to do with words difficult. And on the flip side, I have a twin sister who's incredibly literate, was a voracious reader from a very young age. So those were very defining moments of my childhood. And then I basically decided that I wasn't going to try at these things and not be good at them. So I just wasn't going to try. And so all through my childhood, teenage years, early adulthood, I very much had this persona of, I don't care and everything will work itself out. And, I've always been a rather irrational optimist. And so I've always had this sense that things will work themselves out, which I think to some extent is a self-fulfilling prophecy. But I also think it can get you in trouble, which, we could talk about as well. But so I think that's how I would describe my childhood.
Because don't they say if you're a pessimist, you lose twice? Once when you thought it was going to go badly and then when it actually does go badly.
Yeah, and I think it's a lot of the Henry Ford saying that, either you think you can or you think you can't. Either way, you're right. I've slightly butchered that, but there's a sense of it's the belief that something will work out that actually gets it to work out as well. So
what were the early examples of success that you had, and what did you think in your early adulthood success meant?
That's a great question. My parents both had, good jobs as lawyers. My mother but she took some time off to raise the children. My father was, at that point, had a very kind of high-powered job, partner at a law firm. And what was really interesting was he didn't enjoy that and would communicate that. And I think he came to the conclusion that actually the money wasn't really worth it. And so he retired from that and went on to go and do something himself. So that was probably when I was 9 or 10. And that really gave me a sense of, money isn't everything. which was interesting. So, and he's very much not the kind of very alpha male, masculine figure. So I think he has a lot of traits that I held in high esteem from a young age. So, he's very generous, kind, laid back, all of these things. So I think for me, acting with those traits has always been success. It's like being a really kind person, a generous person. And so I've always much more cared about how I turn up in the world than what I necessarily achieve. That being said, I always had this, slightly irrational belief that everything would work itself out. And there was part of me that, always expected big financial success. And part of me was excited by that as well. So I'd be lying if I said that, everything's altruistic, and because otherwise I probably wouldn't be an entrepreneur.
What was your first job?
I worked washing dishes when I did odd jobs in childhood, but probably 15, spent a summer washing dishes in the kitchen. And I did a few of those kind of jobs over the years. And I think they do teach hard work, because it's a hard shift. And there's very much a sense of, no one else is going to do that job for you. Like, if there's a huge stack of stuff that needs washing,
it's your stack.
Yeah, and I think I definitely had a slightly idle side as a child, especially when it came to school. And so I think faced with this, I had a bit of a reaction of, they didn't really expect me to do all this. But after a while, you realize that no one's coming to save you. You just got to do the work. So I had a few jobs in my childhood, which I think taught me that, like, you just sometimes just have to do the work. And I think my personality, I think it's probably something to do with dyslexia, is to always try and find the easier way to do something, which has strengths and weaknesses. But sometimes there's no way around just getting your head down. And
how did you end up working in tech? That was your first kind of big job out in the world.
Yeah, for sure. So it was after a rather unsuccessful stint at university, did a maths degree up in Leeds. I was not studious there at all, and got to the end of it. I managed to scrape a reasonable degree, but by no means excelled. And then, I half-heartedly applied for some grad schemes. I thought I'd go and work in finance because, maths and enjoyed numbers. But there wasn't much reason apart from that. And I didn't get any jobs, basically. So while I was figuring out what to do next, a friend of mine said, well, why don't you just apply to some startups and go work there for a year, and then in a year you can just reapply to all the grad schemes. Because I think you were saying earlier before we started recording that you always had this sense of, like, there's a path that you feel like you have to do, or there's expectation around. And that was very much just there was this career ladder. I'd seen both my parents go and be lawyers. They actually said their one bit of career advice was don't be a lawyer. But I just thought it was go and work at a big firm and qualifications and all of these things. And I'm very fortunate, I'm very glad and grateful that I didn't manage to achieve that, because I think there are all these intangible skills that actually going into the startup world and doing things yourself really teaches you. So I applied to 20 startups. One of them offered me a job, and so I went to work there.
And how was that experience?
It was an interesting time in my life, because I'd come to it from this place of not taking things seriously, and that was starting to become a big conflict in my life. So I was also drinking a lot and taking a lot of drugs at that time, and so I just had this very I think self-destructive, from some therapy around this, and I think it's a lot of suppressed emotions during my teenage years that would come out when I would go and drink and do all these things, and that really was eating me up inside. Joining this startup was just a big light bulb, because I really enjoyed it, and I enjoyed the intellectual challenge. I was pretty rubbish at all the roles I did there. So I did sales for a year, wasn't a great salesman, ran product for a year, then ran growth for a year. The actual roles I wasn't very good at, but I think I was good at navigating the startup environment, so dealing with people and saying bright things occasionally. So for the first time, really ever, I was kind of very intellectually engaged with what I was doing. And then it just became more and more obvious that this destructive, drinking, going out, and just busyness, I was started to hate my phone at that point. And it just became so obvious that these things were not bringing me happiness, were unhealthy. It didn't occur to me that I could just not do them.
That there might be another way.
Yeah. It was, I did some life coaching when I was 23, 24. And we spoke about everything, about how destructive this drinking and so on was. And never did it come up of, why don't you just not drink,
Right.
It was like, well, we've obviously got to kind of design around this. And it's just so interesting, I think, especially in the UK, like my whole childhood and friendships and teenage years were built around drinking. And that's how we socialize. And so it's so ingrained in the culture. I think that is starting to change these days. But I think there's so many people out there that feel stuck and dissatisfied with their life, and as you say, don't realize that there's another way.
So then what happened next as your life kept speeding up? You kept working and kept drinking.
As I started to more engage with this, the other side of things did just start to get more and more destructive. Again, I think it was this compartmentalizing and suppression of emotions. And so when I did have a drink or go out, then there would just be this kind of, that was when I could express. And I started to look for ways out. So I started to listen to podcasts. Through that, started to read more. Again, I'd never been a big reader, but then something just clicked, and now it's probably my favorite pastime. So I went from a stage where I was barely reading at all to reading all the time. And then things just started to compound. So, through that, got into meditation. And the more of these things I did, the more I realized that, I did not want this other part of my life. And so it just became a bigger and bigger conflict in my mind. And then a friend of mine suggested a silent retreat in the Himalayas, which was a Buddhist temple on top of a mountain. And I initially laughed this off. I think I had a lot of insecurity at that time and just really wasn't sure of myself. And so I was completely put off by what the people in my life would think of me going and doing this. It wasn't like, will I actually enjoy it? It was like, what would the guys at work think if I went and did a Buddhist retreat?
Fear of judgment.
100%. Yeah. I think my life at that point was completely governed by what I thought that other people would think, when actually people aren't thinking about us as much as we think they are. So I eventually just got fed up and was like, look, I'm just going to go and do this. And that was in the summer of 2019. And it really felt like everything kind of reached a bit of a head. Very stressful time at the startup, some relationship stuff around that time. There was just felt like a bit of a pressure cooker going on. Finally got to this silent retreat, and it was just such a release. And the best thing about it was when you get there, they take your phone off you.
Was it Vipassana?
No, I called it Vipassana Light. There was a Vipassana center next door. I have since done a Vipassana, but...
Because they're 10 days. How long was this?
This was also 10 days.
Okay.
Whereas a Vipassana is 8 or 9 hours a day meditating. This is 4, and the rest of the time is Buddhist philosophy. So they teach you the ideas behind Buddhism. So it's a little more relaxing than a Vipassana. Vipassana is like a mental boot camp. But just being offline, I mean, I never, up until this stage of my life, I'd never been on holiday on my own, anything like that. I'd always just been with other people.
And definitely not been on your phone for that long.
Off, exactly. I probably started using an iPhone, I don't know, when I was 12 or 13 or something. And so for the last 12 years, you're right, I wouldn't have had a day or at most off it. So it was hugely eye-opening.
What came up for you?
Actually putting away my phone was just like instant relief. I was like, thank God, whatever is going on out there, just not my problem for 10 days. So that was so liberating. And then the hardest thing about the whole thing was learning to sit cross-legged, because I'd spent my childhood just slouched in a chair, as many people do in the West, and actually just sitting cross-legged with a straight back. I think it's so good for you. So I'll try and do most of my work like that now. But back then it was very hard. And so the first day just seemed to last for, hours and hours and hours, and went to bed in absolute agony after all that sitting. But then what's interesting is you started to, because you've got your present, you're meditating, you're off your phone, you start to notice much more what's happening in your body. So it was really eye-opening to me to feel my muscles adapting and adjusting and dealing with that better on the second and third day. So it was amazing seeing that process. And in terms of the Buddhist philosophy, I went into it very skeptical of religion. So I was, a very kind of proud atheist, where I'd be like, this is obviously nonsense. And how could any rational person believe any of this? So I didn't understand the point of religion. And so the first 3 or 4 days I was listening to it, and, it was just, yeah, sure, very skeptical. And then we got into the Buddhist idea of attachment, which is, I need this to be happy. So, we need the job, the career, the relationship, whatever it might be. And that was just a real watershed moment for me, because I realized that everything in my life had been governed by that up to that point. So, even at that time, I was thinking, do I need to go and do an MBA? I was very dissatisfied with where I was in my career. And it was a huge realization that, everything in Buddhism it really boils down to, we have everything we need to be happy. And actually it's all our cravings and aversions and, the unhappiness that's going through our mind that's causing that, rather than the external circumstances. So that was a huge eye-opener for me. And then I started to realize throughout the retreat that actually a lot of the value in religion is, fundamentally, every religion is just a guide to living a good life. And all of the stories, so, Jesus turning water into wine, or the Buddha being born out of his mother's armpit. Like all of these things just add narrative value, which is making the story easier for people to remember so that it gets passed on and so the wisdom gets passed on. And so I think that was humbling for me because I'd gone in just so sure of myself, at how ridiculous this whole thing was. But then, up until that point, I'd just been so insecure and not sure of myself. And I came back from that retreat just so empowered and just thinking that anything was possible and that everything would be all right. So that was a very profound experience.
Having been fortunate to have some of these experiences myself, I also found that, as they say, it's like in the integration afterwards, so much more comes up. Were there any other kind of big moments or learnings that came in the weeks and months that followed? And what did you do next?
I went through some big life changes pretty quickly. So I didn't intend to make any particular changes when I left the retreat and had to fly straight back to the UK because we were doing a leadership meeting for the quarterly planning for the startup I was working for. And 2 days after I got back, the startup basically disintegrated. So some funding we were trying to get fell through. We had to get rid of half the company. I kept my job, but was running growth at the time. We paused growth spend. So I had a week twiddling my thumbs. And then I think because I'd had this experience and just had this sense of anything's possible. I'd heard about cabin concepts out there, had been reading a lot around digital minimalism, and went for a drink with Ben, who's my now co-founder, told him about the retreat. And over the course of a couple of hours, we just battered around this idea. And basically, off the back of that, Unplugged was born. And then I spent 3 hours Googling cabins on a Friday night just to see, is this going to work? And then I was like, yeah, probably. And then quit my job on Monday.
Wow.
And that was it. So the whole thing was about a week and a half after I got back from the retreat. And then got started on Unplugged and didn't have any money at the time. Didn't quite know what we were going to do with it. But I thought, I've really got to stop this destructive lifestyle now. That didn't last very long. The first couple of weekends was up till 7 in the morning, generally being stupid. And I just thought, this is just not going to work. So I think the hardest thing about a startup is the psychological battle, and it's really believing that you can make it work, and that just doesn't work on a hangover or a come down. And so I really didn't know what to do, and as we said earlier, it didn't occur to me that it was an option to stop drinking or just stop that lifestyle. And then I saw this YouTube video, which was a Joe Rogan clip, a comedian called Nicky Glasser, and it was Nicky Glasser read this book 7 years ago and hasn't drunk since, and the book is called Stop Drinking Now. So I thought, worth a try, ordered the book and stopped. And so I went completely sober for 4 years. I've recently gone a bit less sober, so I feel like I kind of went through a big life rebrand at that stage in life, and then I've almost gone through another one in the last 3 or 4 months for different reasons. But yeah, it's exactly what I needed at that time. And the year or so after that, I was just on this massive high and just felt like life would never throw me any curveballs again, which, as we know, isn't true.
Yeah. Well, in that first year of running Unplugged with your business partner, Ben, what were some of the realities of what happened? Because I think you wanted to start a cabins project that requires physical cabins. You needed upfront costs. Did you build those cabins, buy those cabins? I think there's a lot of glamorization and glorification of what it's like to be a founder and come up with an idea. But what were some of those first year realities?
Yeah, glamorous is definitely not a word I would use for that year. So we had some advice of, why are you actually going to go and buy a cabin? Just put a landing page up and you can run some ads to it and test if people actually want to lock away their phone. But we didn't want to do that because the answer may well have been that people don't want to and they'd rather just go and stay in a cabin. But that wasn't the business that we wanted to build. So we thought the best way to test this is just to actually get a cabin and get it up and running and see what happens. So in February 2020, we didn't have the money, but luckily you can just order it with a deposit. So it was 2,000 euros or so. Ben, my co-founder, was working at the time, so he covered that. And we ordered a cabin, and then a month later, the world changed and COVID hit, which was interesting. So we'd started to have some conversations about, fundraising, and they all went dead. We had a site lined up that dropped out. So we were sat there in the first lockdown in March and April with this cabin on the way. It was being built in Latvia by a Swedish company. And
we had nowhere to put it.
We had nowhere to put it. We had no money to pay for it. So that was we had a bit of a tough moment there. But then, you just kind of, again, you realize no one's coming to save you and you've just got to get your head down and figure it out. The cabin was about £50,000. We managed to scrape together about £23,000 from friends and family. And then we got 15K startup loan, then chipped in a bit, and then after we launched, we managed to get another 7K or so from investors. So it was really, it was super tight, and it was just get money in from wherever we can. And with the sites, the site that had dropped out, nice area of the country, so we thought we'll try around there. And so decided just had to cold call, and the first place we called was like, I've got the perfect spot for this, and that turned out to be it. So it was a very positive experience in the end. I think there's that excitement and naivety and just energy when you're starting something. So then when we launched, we barely got any bookings.
And where was it, the first one?
It was just north of London, kind of Hertfordshire, Essex area, which is actually a beautiful, beautiful part of the country. So we really lucked out with that first site. I spent a lot of times living in East London at the time, so a lot of time just driving up the M11 to go, and we were cleaning it at that point as well. So it was really just, in the early stages, you just got to do everything yourself. We got so much wrong with that cabin, so it was running out of solar power in July. There was all sorts of stuff we had to switch out. Neither of us are handy at all, so we had some.
I heard your door didn't lock.
The door didn't lock. We had to switch out a pellet burner for a wood stove. So pellet burner was this very complicated electric start thing. Had to switch that out, which involves enlarging the hole in the roof, and in that process, I managed to put a Stanley knife through my finger. So
oh no,
that was a tough day. And then I had to go pick up some guests covered in blood and paint. And then went back to A&E when we got to London. So there were lots of moments like that, and it's amazing how at the time everything feels so existential. But then you look back and you just find a way through. Like, I think startups are much more resilient than they feel, and actually when they do stop or fail, it's usually because the founders had enough and just can't go on, which is again completely understandable because it's a tough psychological game.
So I actually don't have a sponsor, and there aren't any commercial breaks in this season. Instead, I wanted to use this little pause to say how much we would love to hear from you. We want to get to know our audience better. There are lots of different ways to practice slowing down and lots of different people and stories we can hear from. So please leave a comment or a review on this episode to share your thoughts. Tools you use to slow down, someone you'd like to suggest for the show, or just your thoughts on the episode. This really helps us plan future episodes and cover things that you might be interested in. Now, back to the show. Was there a tipping point that you felt like, okay, this is actually now turning a profit and we can open more sites and there's a real business case for this?
Yeah, we didn't wait for turning a profit for open more sites, but there was a tipping point about a couple of months in when, again, we weren't doing great on the booking side of things. But then an influencer came to stay. We actually got in touch with him about investing, and he said, I'm not investing at the moment, but I'm free this weekend. I'll come and take some photos. He had 300,000 followers. He posted, then the Evening Standard got in touch, and then everything just snowballed. And actually the fact that we'd launched after COVID meant that everyone had spent months in flats in London on screens. So it was very timely in that sense. So for the first year and a half, we basically didn't have to do any marketing because we just got endless inbound PR. So that worked really well. We have always had the mindset of we'll just order the cabins and then figure out how to pay for them. So it was very much a case of get the next couple of cabins ordered and then go and fundraise and find out how to pay for them. And that went on for a very long time. So, which I think is not so good for your sanity. Ben, my long-suffering co-founder, I think I've put him through a few tricky situations over the years because I very much handled that side of things. And he's a real trooper. So he's kind of let me just figure it out.
I love your kind of antithetical business model because most people would say, do so much market research, like know your client, know that this customer exists for you before you go and do anything. And you were like, what if we do the survey and people say they don't want this? We don't want that. So it's so counter to the normal kind of business advice that you'd receive. Is that advice that you would give a founder now? Would you say if you believe something works, don't do a survey? Or...
Yeah, well, I think data generally is so subjective, and there's a million different ways to interpret some information.
It's also how do you ask the questions? They can be leading.
100%. There's so much bias in it, our own biases, kind of biases from the people answering. And so I think like we almost do it because we don't have the conviction, so we think we kind of need to get the answers elsewhere. But there's a lot to be said for if you want to make something that's actually going to move society in a different direction, then you probably don't want to just ask everyone in society kind of what they need, because
it's a novel idea.
100%, yeah. So I think it really came from a place of having a deep conviction that this was missing. I think so much of where startups and companies end up going is towards the insight and how the team sees the world. And so I think with every company, like, that is one of the assets and things that's going to shape the direction of the company more than anything else. So you can have two companies that start out on a very similar path, but if the people in those companies see the world very differently, then they're going to end up taking very, very different directions. So I think I've always focused on, like, really being clear on, like, what is the change we want to make in the world, and using that as a guiding light, because I think, and perhaps I'm just rationalizing and trying to justify my laziness that I didn't want to go out and do all the market research, but I'm just very skeptical of that. And I think you also just learn by doing. Like, you don't have to have the right answer out the gate. Like, there's a lot to be said for just getting started with something and figuring out as you go, because I think the hardest thing with any company is getting started, and once you're in motion, it's easier to stay in motion. And there are so many reasons not to get started. I just don't have the right temperament for going and analyzing and doing all of that. It's very much kind of go with the gut. Again, I think it's a dyslexic thing. Dyslexic people they do more in the right side of the brain than the left side of the brain. So less good with, in the left side of the brain is where you master technical detail. So things like learning languages, learning skills, you really have to get into the details of it to become proficient, whereas the right side of the brain is the kind of bigger picture stuff. So dyslexic people are less good at details, but better at getting the gist. And this is the kind of thing where, got the gist, this is kind of where we want to go, have a good feel for it.
And what was the change that you wanted to see in the world? And we've obviously mentioned Unplugged, the cabins, but what is it that people do in those cabins? And what is it that you wanted them to do? And then what is the change that you hoping that would make culturally?
So very simply, what happens at Unplugged is you go for 3 nights, either by yourself or with a partner. You literally lock your phone in a box upon arrival. And then we give you a map, a Nokia, and a Polaroid camera, and leave you to it for 3 days. So the whole point is we actually want to get you offline for 3 days. As you were saying earlier, like, most people probably haven't, especially most couples, probably haven't spent a day together off their phones in the last decade. And I think the big insight that we went into this with is that makes a huge difference. I think we massively underestimate just how affected we are by our phones. Like, even having a phone switched off on the table, it reduces the empathy between two people, and it also reduces your intelligence. So you'll perform worse in an intelligence test if you have a phone switched off. Now imagine if you're, if you're a couple and want to use scrolling through TikTok for 3 hours when you're on the sofa next to each other. Obviously that does even more. Again, come from a tech startup, so obviously hugely aware and behind the value that these technologies bring to the world. But I think it's only when you take your phone away that you realize just what we've lost. So when you get off your phone, the first day you're actually a bit more anxious. You kind of feel like you've lost a limb, but then the mind really starts to settle down. And by the second day or so, we start to get this deep sense of calm. And what's crazy is that is how we're built to operate. Like, humans aren't built to live in this low-level anxiety that we all walk around with all day. And it's going through that experience really helps change your perspective. So when we launched, we got some criticism at the start around, you can't change someone's habits in 3 days. There's like, you need 21 days to change your habit. So this is a complete waste of time. But that misses the point, because it's not about changing habits.
A reminder that this is possible for you.
Yeah, or even a realization that this is possible. Exactly. So it's about changing your perspective, because once you've seen that and you've seen that the world doesn't end in 3 days, and you've also seen what state you can get to, you almost feel supernatural literally just by taking your phone away. And so what's really interesting is all of the momentum in society is towards spending more time online. You look around on the tube nowadays and everyone's just face down in their phone. And the change we're trying to make in the world is to move that momentum in another direction. Because if we can get to a stage where we have hundreds or thousands of cabins and we have hundreds of thousands of people doing this every year, then that does create some profound changes in society. Because all of those people, what we found is that the more time you spend offline, the more you crave time offline. And so if you can start people out on that journey of actively seeking to be more offline and gaining all the benefits from that, then I think that makes a really interesting change.
It's like the taste that you had from your retreat in the Himalayas, trying to provide a condensed version of that. And you mentioned the tube. I found it very sad now that there's 5G at so many stations. I'm seeing people like on calls on the tube, which was previously almost like a little bit of a sacred space of like not being actively on phone calls. So you've now had 5 years of this. Have there been any stories, anecdotal stories that have come from your customers that have really moved you?
We get a lot of people who will come and stay, and they'll get in touch afterwards to tell us about just little changes they've made in their life. So you'll get couples who will go for dinner once a week at a restaurant and leave their phones at home. And I think those small things are amazing. We also get people who will buy the physical maps that we have in the cabins, and then they'll use that to navigate around their neighborhood. So I think it's really just these little steps that people can take on that journey. You know, we've had a lot of engagements at the cabins. We have a lot of couples who come back every anniversary. So every anniversary, they want to go and spend 3 days offline together. And so I think what's really surprised us is just how couples focused it's been. Because I think when we started out, again, it very much came from this almost solitude of a silent retreat in the Himalayas. We expected it would be people going and journaling and reading and whatever it is. But actually, it's predominantly been couples. And I think that has really surprised and moved us, which is just what a profound experience it can be for two people in a relationship. And it's also, you go through the whole range of emotions. So
it sounds like good therapy, yeah.
100%. So quite often, especially that first day when you're a bit more anxious, there can be a flaming row. And then actually that is just something that needs to clear. And then there's an amazing kind of bonding afterwards. So yeah, I've had many people talking about just how profound it's been for their relationship.
And now as the company grows, how do you balance being a founder and the challenges, stresses, overwork, overwhelm that comes with running a business that is literally about slowing down? Does it ever feel like there's a paradox in what you're doing, or are you able to kind of preach or practice what you preach, rather?
Yeah, every day
is an existential struggle.
No, it's I try and practice what I preach, because it's not just going offline to forsake the whole world. It's the benefits of that. So I think so much of your role, my role as a founder, is to really see and understand the game you're playing. So really see the forest for the trees. And it's so hard to do when you're in the weeds of the business the whole time.
Yes.
And what I've noticed, I've really kind of been through many different periods running the company, and some of those have been super intense. And what I've noticed is when I'm my busiest, it comes from a place of insecurity. So it comes from a place of, I'm feeling bad because I haven't solved this thing that I think is my responsibility, but I've overcompensated by just being busy. It's like, I'm going to throw myself into it so that I feel better about myself. And that has not been productive. And so some of my most productive times have been when I've slowed down more, when, you know, I have practiced more and I preach. But it's hard to do, right? It's, you know, there's almost this kind of pendulum of, you go through periods of feeling very tranquil, and then some shit happens and you've really got to sort it out. And you'll go through a more stressful period. And I find that in those periods, calendars just fill up, and you much more just get kind of swept along with everything. And then it's only really when I prioritize going and switching off. And what's interesting, I obviously do, you know, I go and stay in our cabins every probably 3 or 4 months. And whenever I do it, always the insight, there's a couple of things. One is, being away from the people in your life really makes you appreciate who those people are, and you realize there's a big quality over quantity thing with relationships. Because I think, especially living in a city like London, like the amount of people we see each day, and you know, the amount of random coffees and all of these things, you just end up sacrificing time with the closest people in your life.
It's all an opportunity cost.
100%, yeah. And relationships really compound as well. So it's so much more nourishing spending that extra time with, you know, your family or your closest friends. And so I think it's really helped me to appreciate that. And I'm a classic people pleaser, so I end up saying yes to far more than I should, and I'm getting better at that. But I've really focused on that, because I realized that actually, you know, we've only got so much time in this world, and much rather spend more with, you know, the people that, I think when all is said and done on your deathbed, it's who you spend your life with that matters, rather than how you spent it. And the other big realization is, like, why am I so busy? You know, like, I look at my diary for the next couple of weeks, because I have a physical diary, which has been a big eye opener. And so half of this shit is completely pointless, and I'm just doing it because that person asked me to, like, not because I want to. And so always I'll come out and just like cancel at least half the things that I'd scheduled to do. And so I really have to remind myself to go and get or really schedule in these periods of going and switching off, because I think I'm in a bit of a period now where I've just been really heads down for 2 or 3 months. And so I'm actually going to house sit at a friend's house in France for 2.5 weeks in May. We'll take a week completely offline as part of that. Like, that will just be a big reset and set me up for the next period. But yeah, always whenever I go and do these things, I think to myself, like, why didn't I do this sooner?
Well, sounds like you have these regular few months or quarterly moments where you do this like big reset and you're not on your phone. Is there anything that you've started to take into your day-to-day to support you on a micro level to slow down?
Yeah, so a few things. One is I'll try to go offline between 6 and 7 p.m. Every day until 8 a.m. the next morning. So then there's just 13 hours or so there. Obviously you're sleeping for most of it, but where there's quiet, and it's a chance to integrate what's happened during the day and really reflect. So that has been incredibly valuable. And then I think it's things like making peace with the fact that my email inbox is not my to-do list, and I can just archive emails. If someone has emailed me, I don't owe it to them to reply. And I know there's a big thing around ghosting. I don't want to be that guy, but it's like, if I just replied to all of my emails, then I would be employed in nothing else, and I would not make any impactful changes in this world. So I think I've had to make peace with that as a people pleaser. Same with WhatsApps. Like, if something's really important, then people will find a way to get hold of you. And there's a sense of, when I send someone a message, I just forget about it, and I don't worry whether or not I don't think about it all day long. But then when someone sent me a message, I think that they're there thinking, why hasn't Hector replied? Oh my gosh, I'm so sad. They don't care. They really don't care. And so I'm trying to make peace with that much more, of like, it's okay to not be super responsive. And when I have go back to people and been like, I'm so sorry, and I know this has been months, they're like, oh, you're Mr. Unplugged. That obviously,
right,
I didn't expect you to reply.
Part of the personal brand.
Part of the brand, yeah. So I think it's a big one for me has just been like learning to let people down in my mind and just be less available and prioritize better, and that has been very helpful.
I definitely struggle with the busy and the emailing thing, because I spend most of my day being reactive to emails, and as you say, working in my business rather than on my business. And it doesn't feel like the best use of my time. It's like when people say, what are you good at? It's like, well, I'm really good at creative directing and telling stories and doing sales and doing pitches. And that's actually not what I spend most of my time doing. So trying to figure out ways to reorganize that time is difficult. Another problem that I have is, how do you balance ambition and purpose and all these things you want to create, the culture change that you're aiming for, with contentment and trying not to overwork and staying offline? And what are your thoughts on legacy?
I think fundamentally one big realization I had during a bit of a personal last year, as mentioned, and one big realization I had during that was like, it is all going to be over in a flash, and soon it will all be gone and we will all be forgotten. And if I get remembered for 1 year after I die or 1,000, it just doesn't matter. So I less and less, I'm not bothered about legacy. There definitely is still ego driving me. I think there's many things, as with every entrepreneur, right? There is a real sense of, I want to make this change into the world. There's a real sense of, I love games, I love the intellectual stimulation of company building. And there's definitely a sense of, I want to show the world how special and smart I am, because I couldn't show that at school as a little dyslexic boy. And so I think it's just understanding which of these things are driving us at various points. And there are so many things with startups where you make bad decisions because it is an ego trip, right? Like hiring, such an ego trip. You're like, oh my God, it's so sad I can hire this person. Go and hire loads of people, and then you overhire and you've got to let them go. And the startup I was at before, we grew to 70 people, completely unsustainable. And then we had to get rid of, they eventually got rid of 90% of the company, and then they went on to grow it to profitable and got a good result. So there are all these things where you're just chasing these milestones. I think fundraising is a classic example as well, where the number that people can achieve in fundraising, is very much the goal, so they can do the LinkedIn post.
Correct.
And they're much less concerned around what are the terms. I know people.
How much do I own of my business at the end?
How much do I own? What do I have to pay back of this debt? Like, I know one particular company who raised announced like a 40 million Series B, and it was mostly debt, and it was on terrible terms. They nearly lost the whole company on it. Again, like understanding what is driving the decisions. So financially, I know it's easy to say this and whether or not it's believable, but like I really don't mind what number I end up with, right? Because like I have enough now. I'm on decent enough salary. Like there's a roof over my head. I can buy books. I can go away occasionally. So like I don't need more. That being said, I think there's a big part of me that wants to just go and achieve and turn this into a massive company. And so I think we do have a lot of ambition. I have a lot of ambition to do this. And I think part of that is loving the game. So I've always loved games. I've always loved, and there's like a mastery thing of just learning to be better and better in it. And the irony is, as a founder, at every stage, you're a complete beginner at what it takes to win at that stage. But I think there's a sense of, loving the game. And there's also a huge sense, and one of the biggest things that drives me is I really want this to be a successful outcome for especially all the people who work in the company. I am just one of a bigger team. I don't know, I just feel very grateful and just kind of proud to be working with all of those people. And so again, I'm a people person. And so I think, again, on my deathbed, if I look back, if I'd really done well by these people who have come along and kind of joined on this journey, like that matters to me much more than like, how much money I had to go and buy a house after all of this. But in terms of enough, like, I'm just playing to play. I think there's a sense of, as the company grows, like a lot of founders love the early stage, they love the ideas, they love the kind of prototyping and iterating and, all of this kind of testing at the start. I much more enjoy the later stage stuff of like the systems thinking. And as the game becomes more complex in terms of the company becomes bigger, the competitive landscape, like that's much more intellectually stimulating for me. So there's a sense of I've still got a long time left, a lot left in the tank to do this, because I'm enjoying it more and more as we grow. So I think there's much more a kind of intrinsic motivation around why I'm doing this now than any particular exit.
Well, that's good. You mentioned the LinkedIn post, which I think is so relevant because a lot of people are doing things because they think it's what other people will be impressed by, and it's what they see around them. And that's really people looking for that external validation of, there's a difference between, as you say, seeing that from your family and your tighter community and your employees that you care about and you're having daily interactions with, versus receiving that from the masses that you don't even know, that are strangers to you. Why do you think we seek that kind of external validation?
Yeah, well, I think it's very primal because, fundamentally we are tribal animals. And so I think we are just completely wired to deeply care what the tribe thinks of us. And I think so much of the unhappiness and issues we have today is that we fundamentally have not biologically changed since we were hunter-gatherers. This is the big thing that Yuval Noah Harari talks about in Sapiens. And yet we're living in this environment that we're so poorly suited for. We are built to live in tribes of up to 150 people and deal with the social dynamics there. Now we're dealing with millions, and so it just sends our brains into haywire, because fundamentally we have this deep need for acceptance by the tribe, because back when you were a hunter-gatherer, if you weren't accepted by the tribe, it meant death, right? Like if you were ostracized, then you were out there on your own and you had no one to protect you. So there is this very, very kind of strong primal need for acceptance and being part of the tribe. And then when you put out a LinkedIn post, it's the same mechanism where you're judging the number of likes and comments. You're kind of attaching your self-worth to that. So, I mean, I'm not on any social media apart from LinkedIn, and I have a very mixed relationship with it, because on one hand, it's great for the business, and, there are posts that do very well on there. Cabins look great on LinkedIn. Our unique mission does very well on LinkedIn. But I can feel myself more anxious when I'm spending time on there, when I'm looking through the newsfeed and seeing what everyone else is up to, when I'm posting and wondering how many likes it's going to get. So there's just this very interesting dynamic of just understanding, and again, like, what's the motivation? Because there have been times when I've been like, we need to really double down on, or I need to double down on this and like learn how to hack LinkedIn because it'd be great for the business. But then a big part of that is actually also an ego thing. And it's like, actually, do I just want to be like famous? And that's why I want to do it. And so it's just understanding, like, it's what I was saying earlier around why are you starting this and where is each decision coming from? And it's like, which part of me is pushing this? Because there was a time last year when I was really like, okay, I need to double down on LinkedIn. And then after a couple of months, I was like, this is a huge fucking distraction. I need to be fundraising. And it's just because I don't know where that money's going to come from. So I'm distracting myself by trying to be a fucking LinkedIn influencer. So I think it really takes a level of self-awareness and introspection to realize that. Because, you know, we fool ourselves.
Yeah, the self-reflection and kind of really understanding your own triggers and wishes for something are so interesting in that capacity. Is there someone whose life that you see that you really admire and why?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say who I thought of straight away, which was Gandhi. There's not much in this day and age that comes from like a true place of compassion, especially when you talk about achievement and striving and, you know, the whole startup scene and leadership and all of these things. Like, so much of it comes from ego. And I think what I love about Gandhi is it came from a place of, you know, deep compassion. And I think at my best, post this first silent retreat I've just had this sense of kind of unconditional compassion. And I think when you get in that state, it just transcends everything else. Nothing else matters, and you know you can just ease through life. And I just think it's a beautiful way of living. And he was someone who lived that on the world stage for decades. And actually just took action. I think one of the things the Dalai Lama says is how Buddhists, I don't identify as being Buddhist, but I love the wisdom, don't take enough action. I know the most content I would be in this life is to go and live in a monastery for the next 50 years, you know. But I don't want that. I want to be out in the world. I want to be, you know, making changes, really like being the change I want to see in the world, having a family, like doing all these things that these things that really make us human, and engaging with the trials and tribulations of life.
You also mentioned that you're now in a sort of third phase of your life. What is that phase? Yeah,
so interestingly, about 4 or 5 months after I stopped drinking, so it was when I was starting Unplugged, really good headspace, I started to get these weird autoimmune issues. So I get these like immune system flare-ups, so burning sensation, it would last for 72 hours, keep me up during the night. Couldn't figure out what it was. Went to an allergy clinic, they gave me all these antihistamines. That would keep it away, but every time I stopped them, it would come back. That went on for about a year. And then I went to a Chinese doctor, similar thing. He gave me this bag of twigs and leaves. Yeah.
I've been given the bag before.
Yeah, exactly. So I had to brew those for 2 hours every day, which was unbelievably inconvenient. Again, it kept the symptoms away, but every time I stopped, it would come back. And then a couple of years after it had started, it started to get a lot worse. So I moved with my partner at the time up to Epping Forest, and I started to feel like rough and hungover every day. I saw, you know, every type of expert you can imagine, and eventually figured out that it was due to mold poisoning from household mold. And so it started the long and cumbersome detox process for that about a year ago now. And
that was the house in Epping Forest?
Yes. So the first flat had some mold in where I'd got the initial thing, but then that house in Epping Forest, because it was right by the forest, had mold all over the bedroom walls at some point, and you can clean it off, but the spores get everywhere. So that all made a lot of sense. Started a very long detox process. Wasn't really getting better for 3 or 4 months, and then read a book by Gabor Maté called The Myth of Normal about. Have you ever read it? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a beautiful book, isn't it? And he talks in that around how 90% of people he meets with these chronic conditions have the same personality type, which is the people pleaser, put other people's emotions before yourself, and suppress, basically. And suppression of emotions has been a specialist subject of mine. I'm actually just doing some therapy in the last couple of months, which has been very revealing about how, as an emotional 8 or 9-year-old boy, I basically learned that, you know, being upset and crying and showing emotions was not well received at school. And so made the decision to just lock all of that away. And I'm just going to tell everyone that all is well, everything is fine. And that just became my fucking mantra for the next 20 years.
But then the body keeps a score and we internalize that.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that had never occurred to me. And obviously, what's interesting is it all started after I stopped drinking, because what drinking does is it allows you to express. So my therapist recently described that as stopping my medication, right? Because at least when I was having these, and again, I think the nights out was so big because I had so much suppressed. So it was when it had a chance to release, it would really fucking release. And so just went on that journey of realizing that actually I needed to work on unsuppressing my emotions. A girlfriend at the time was very good at encouraging me to live a little. So I started having a drink again and eating some sugary things and all these things that I hadn't done for years. And so I've been on that journey the last few months, and for the first time in 4 or 5 years have really seen my health massively improve. So this next period is more about balance and living a little and expressing my emotions.
What are the other ways to release? Are there any other tips that have worked?
I'm early on the journey, so I wouldn't say I'm an expert in emotional expression, but yeah, things like dance, kind of screaming into a pillow, like all of these things where we actually allow ourselves to express emotions, but also talking through it as well and labeling emotions. There were some very interesting sessions where I would describe something and my therapist would be like, what emotion did you feel at the time? And I'd be like, I'm not sure I felt any emotion. And it's very hard for me to pin it down, because I just had this I just had years of just kind of building up this mask almost. And so I think it's really spending the time like actually trying to feel that emotion in you and giving it the chance to get out.
We also don't have the emotional vocabulary. We have mad, sad, bad, glad.
Yeah.
Right? We have like 4 words that we can use to say how we feel.
Yeah.
And my friend who's a therapist has a chart.
Love that.
With, 2 indexes of like from, I don't know, not very angry to very angry, or like satisfied to not very satisfied. And like all of the words in between that you can use to choose a feeling. And she has them choose where they're at today at the beginning of the session. And there's about 100 words. So you actually have to stop and look and think. You can't just pick happy. You have to like find the right word on that index. And it's a free tool available online. You can like Google these kind of like feeling charts of words that I think are super, super helpful. Wow, it's great that you're going on that journey. I'm also interested about the mold, because that's something that is not openly talked about so much. There aren't many companies like fixing this problem, and it is pervasive and a huge issue in the UK, especially people in ground floor flats, people in I'm in a ground floor flat.
It's such an eye-opener. Like, it's unbelievable how little known this is and how often it's been found at the core of health issues, serious autoimmune conditions like Crohn's disease, multiple sclerosis. So I think we massively underestimate the effect it's having on our health. There's a genetic deficiency that about 28% of the population have, which makes them, myself included, worse at detoxing mold toxins. So when we inhale mold spores, like mold is obviously natural, it's something you'd get in nature anyway, but now that we're living in these buildings, these kind of moldy flats, as you say, you suddenly got a much denser kind of population in a smaller space. And so we're being overwhelmed we inhale the spores and they release something called mycotoxins, and they are incredibly toxic to humans. And usually our body can detox them. But what happens is when we're less able to detox and these things start to get in our cells, then it actually affects the body's ability to detox. So you get sicker and sicker over time. The sicker you get, the worse you get at detoxing, the more toxins build up. And it starts to show up in all these weird ways. You get all these weird autoimmune conditions. And there are all these things. There's been this big rise in things like long COVID and just all of these multi-year things. And what's interesting is modern medicine is so poorly set up for this, because fundamentally it's all about just treating the symptoms. And these symptoms are so random and wide-ranging. And often these treatments cause other issues. So we have people who have just been told, and again, I don't want to sit here and diagnose anyone else. It's obviously a very tough topic, but there are a lot of people who have been told that they have this for life and there's nothing they can do. And they have been given some drug that's going to cause issues somewhere else in the system, and that's just it. And then but
it's actually their environment and the fact that they're living. And I
think there's so much, like, we have such a siloed view of medicine. Like the fact that psychology isn't taken into consideration when you go and see a GP is mental, apart from like, are you stressed? But things like childhood trauma, which Gabor Maté talks about in that book, like these things have huge ramifications. Like the body really does keep the score. So
Don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain.
Exactly, yeah. And I think we're only really starting to wake up to that now, but change on this kind of scale just takes so much time. So yeah, I do think that it will come out more and more just how much of an issue this is. And yeah, I mean, the issue is that it's such a complicated thing to treat. So it's hard to diagnose. But yeah, it really needs to get more airtime.
You also mentioned, and I really wanted to kind of return to that, your realization of your childhood and how much you'd kept your emotions in. And obviously a lot of people right now are watching and talking about the show Adolescence, the Netflix kind of crime drama miniseries. And that show is fundamentally about a kind of crisis that we have of toxic masculinity and boys thinking that they can't express their emotions, and it's frowned upon at school, it's frowned upon at home. What do you hope will happen? Do you think it's important that like more people are getting therapy and understanding this? Is there a way that with parenting in school we can teach young boys that those emotions are valid, that they should show them?
What I really hope is, again, like we just approach this topic with compassion, because what you're getting is really horrible and toxic behavior. You know, there's that whole kind of incel toxic masculinity movement is horrible. And so I think the issue with that is it then completely polarizes everyone else. So everyone thinks, you know, these guys are terrible and the bad guys. And that only compounds the issue more, because then they feel rejected by society. So it leads them to go further down that rabbit hole. And I think it's a lot of our problems today come from this polarization. And you know, the more polarized we become, the further it pushes us apart. So I think, again, it obviously starts at childhood, and fundamentally it comes from parents, it comes from teachers. But I think there's a lot to be said for treating, you know, you've got to treat these young boys with compassion and exactly what you said, which is help them learn how to express their emotions. You know, I'm a big believer, very controversial opinion, but I don't think there is such thing as a bad person. You know, I think we have this judgment of like, this person is bad, and what we're really saying is like, I am a better person than them. And it's like, you have not been through what they've been through. And again, some people might have what looked like a mundane childhood and they go and do terrible things. A lot of people who do terrible things were sexually abused as children. There's a huge amount of people on death row in Texas who sustained prefrontal cortex damage as a child. That's your reasoning part of your brain. They get that damaged in childhood, and then they go and do these terrible things. And like, who am I to judge that person when they had that happen to them and they went on to do this? But I think as soon as we start to categorize people into they are a bad person, then we're shunning them away, and it just compounds the issue. So I think, as with everything, my big hope is that we can just approach it with more compassion and understand that, you know, we are all just people trying to live in this complicated world.
My final question is, and I have so many other questions I could ask you, but I feel like we're going in so many directions. And it's what I ask all of my guests. If I had to watch one film or read one book or go and see one piece of art that would help me understand you better, what would it be?
That's a great question. So there's a beautiful book called Awareness by
I love Awareness.
You know, yeah, I think that's been the big journey I've been on in the last few years, I think.
He's very aggressive. It's almost funny. Like there's so many self-help books that I think are very serious and try very hard to get the words right and make sure they're not offending anyone. He's very to the point.
Yeah, but that's what I love about it. I think there's a chapter in there called I'm an ass, you're an ass. And the whole thing is like, why does that even matter? Like, you know, why are we taking ourselves so seriously? And there's something beautiful about that book, how we should just loosen the grip we have on just how serious everything is. And I think there's a beautiful message in there. Do you have a favorite? Do you have a book or a film or that you would?
For me, I mean, the thing that comes to mind is there was a ESPN 30 for 30 documentary. Do you remember when ESPN did this? They did kind of 30 documentaries about different things in sport in the world. Okay. And they had one on Vlade Divac and Dražen Petrovic, who were basketball players from former Yugoslavia, who went on to play for America, the Lakers and New York. And It's called Once Brothers.
Yeah.
And it's about the civil war and the breakdown of Yugoslavia told from the perspective of two basketball players that went from being best friends who played on the same national team and, won Olympics and were one of the best teams in the world to being pitted against one another in a civil war that was, by nature of civil wars, like neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. I really like that documentary because it's very hard to explain to people the destruction that a civil war can create, and also to try and explain what happened in the country that I'm from. And I was born with a Yugoslavian passport, and
Really? Wow.
I'm Serbian. And so I feel like somebody watching that documentary would help them to really have a better understanding of me, even though it's about two men who are 6 foot something basketball players.
I love it. It's a much better answer than me.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Hector.
No, it's been such a joy. Thank you so much.
Thank you for tuning in. This episode was hosted and created by me, Tiana Tambridge. It was produced by Whitney Rosenthal. Sound and video recording, mixing, editing, and mastering is by Brazen Studios. Cover art designed by Natalia Ruche. Please subscribe to The Slowdown to be notified of upcoming episodes, tell a friend, and leave a review, because it really helps a new podcast like this get out there into the world. And remember, we're all heading to the same destination, and there is no prize for getting there early, so we might as well slow down.